We don't ever want to pass up, it seems, an opportunity to escalate.
Mr. Chairman.
All right.
Mr. Chairman, I am tired of it.
Public believes it, just I'm not through.
Cause of this crap.
This bull crap that you guys throw out here really gets old after a while.
I've got a Valium pill here that you might want to take before the second round.
I said I wasn't going to yield to you. You can shut up now.
Wait just
How many times do we do this?
But we want to just fight. I abandon the chair.
We have a crisis in government.
We're gonna go in there, we're gonna impeach them.
When sparks ignite
They hate our country.
and flames spread beyond their control.
I was not happy when I heard that chant.
It was despicable.
We're being torn apart.
We have a crisis in culture. When social media connects extremists
I think the Civil War is already coming.
and disconnects the rest.
You and I are looking each other in the eye right now, and you don't see a whole lot of that human interaction.
And we have a crisis in politics and the media when talking trash gets far more coverage than talking policy.
Have you seen his hands? They're like this. When I was doing that, all these networks would cut in live. And you know what they say about men with small hands? That sort of conflict drives more ratings. People have figured that out, and that's how they get on television. Politicians get that. They recognize that I want to be on the news, I need to say outrageous things, and so it feeds into it.
Do you regret those insults back and forth, the tit for tat?
Yeah, and I said it at the time because it's not who I am, it's not why I ran.
We'll examine the causes and potential remedies for a nation divided in this round of Money, Power, and Politics. American politics is broken because we're living through a sudden and sharp rise of ignorance, and with it, a collapse of civility. And in meeting with activists and protesters on both sides, I found a lot of people trying to lead the way who are completely lost themselves. By the way, I did not include any of those people in the interviews you're about to see. Instead, I selected people who appear to have a higher level of knowledge about the system and the problem at hand.
So like I said, I'm the director of communication. I work in communications. So obviously I love the media. I love the news.
Well, when I meet anyone who tells me how much they love the news, I often ask where they like to get their news and often get the same response.
I don't really watch the news. I get all my updates through Twitter.
Wait a minute, might that be part of the problem?
I don't know. I think that Twitter, we get the crunch of it, and news is just kind of long and drawn out, and we just want the updates as quick as we can.
You don't want the long, drawn-out, boring stuff. You just want the emotional stuff.
Yeah.
And so you hear people on both sides calling one another foul, charged words that keep popping up on their feeds.
What were you saying to the lady who just came by?
That she's a fascist because she wants.
The lady who came by is a fascist?
Yes.
How do you know she's a fascist?
Because she's trying to silence us, and when people are trying to
I did not see her trying to silence you. There was just a bunch of yelling back and forth. There wasn't a lot of silence. There was no silence.
Yeah, the term fascist is now slung around so much and appears so frequently on social media feeds, a lot of people take it to more generally mean someone who is rude and tells you to shut up.
Well, when you're insulting people and yelling the things she's yelling, that's fascism.
Which is how people on both sides can so quickly call other people who tell them to shut up fascist.
Now, did you insult her by calling her a fascist?
No, I was calling her what she was, a fascist.
Until you take the time to explain what the word means.
Oh, okay. Then I guess I don't know what fascism is.
And then at that point, people tend to say, well, maybe both sides should tone it down.
Do you ever feel that there's just too much shouting in the streets, people just egging each other on?
Yes.
People are just engaging in it too much?
Yes,
and
which I just did.
Which brings us to another charged word people on both sides throw around a lot.
What do you think of the debate in terms of how it played out?
It was very racist.
Racist? What was racist? You don't think it's a little overheated to call them racist?
No. If you look at the definition of racism.
Well, a racist holds the twisted belief that some people are superior or inferior to others based on their race, and that people should be hated or treated or mistreated accordingly. But people will interpret the word racism to more generally mean someone who disagrees with them. Particularly if someone thinks their culture embraces a particular position, they may see someone who opposes that position as racist.
Well, what is the definition of racism?
Well, when you do not agree with another group, their culture, when you do not agree with another group's culture.
It inflames the dialogue that is not much of a dialogue to begin with.
People just seem to be yelling past each other.
Yeah, it was very horrible. I feel like nervous walking through this huge group of Trump supporters.
I'm witnessing the yelling on both sides here,
Yeah.
so you can see where they may feel nervous too.
Yeah, I can see that.
Well, two things are causing this. The first cause, schools scaled back or stopped teaching history and civics. Former Governor Bob Graham helped revive civics in Florida schools years ago, and he told me that civics education was slashed by politicians because politicians benefit from having uninformed voters.
There is, unfortunately, a core of people in politics who think it's not to their advantage to have the public very well informed. If more people became engaged, maybe there'd be more opponents running against them when they ran for re-election.
Second cause, people stop reading and watching traditional news, and wingnut commentators and social media now deliver the only stuff a lot of people see.
That's also, you can see both sides quick. News
But
is
on
normally,
Twitter, you're going to see the stuff that gets the most likes first.
Yeah, you're going to see that.
And that's going to be the stuff that's going to get you angry.
Yeah, normally.
And many who no longer watch or read traditional news now define or interpret the word news to mean a superficial tidbit used to provoke rather than inform.
Nowadays, a lot of people like to see aggression from both sides because it gets them going.
And both sides score likes and those little angry faces.
Yeah, I think people are just going to argue to try to get the Trump people going, and then the Trump people are just going to try to get the Dems going.
Why do you just want to get them going? What is that? What purpose does that serve?
I don't know. I think they just want to get a reaction out of them so they have something that will go live or go viral. That's kind of the era it is today.
Pew Research studies now show around 2/3 of Americans get their news through social media. But the algorithms only expose them to stuff that reinforces their pre-existing beliefs. And a majority who get their news on social media expect it to be inaccurate anyway. And knowing that, they still go there to get their information.
I don't listen to Trump because I don't believe anything that he said. I just feel
But
like...
wait a minute, but how would you not believe him if you don't listen to him?
No, I mean through Twitter.
It forms two tribes, both sides locked in no matter what, until you pull individuals from the group, inject context or nuance, and press them to think.
What would you say to someone who's given lots of money to propel Chuck Schumer's political interests?
Money talks and BS walks.
To those who oppose Republican orthodoxy on trade?
My opinion, for those who oppose the Republican orthodoxy on trade, you had 8 years, and all Obama did was take us down.
What about those who continue to spin us in a path to going broke?
The ones that continue to do that are the Democrats.
Wait a minute, didn't President Trump give Schumer a lot of money, and didn't he oppose Republican orthodoxy on trade, and isn't he signing off on the budgets that are taking us a path to Greece?
I believe so.
If the Lincoln-Douglas debates played out today, who would win?
That's a good one. Douglas.
Douglas would win? Why would Douglas beat Lincoln?
You're talking about housing, clean water, paved streets.
I don't think they were paving streets back then.
In an age in which the president lauds colonial patriots for taking over airports, studies show more than 1/3 of all Americans don't know which century we fought the American Revolution. 60% have no idea who we fought in World War II. Only 1 in 3 American citizens could pass the test we require for new citizens. When you combine the breakdown in civics and history education with the rise of social media, this is what you get.
Everybody's getting upset, and then you feel like your voice isn't heard, so you have to respond in the same way to get your voice heard.
We'll show you specifically how politicians created this mess and ways to clean it up when we come back. We're living in the age of hostility and dysfunction in politics, in which discourse is dumbed down and the art of compromise is lost. Well, to figure out how to fix this, we need to understand what changed step by step. We'll start in the 1980s with President Ronald Reagan and House Speaker Tip O'Neill. Well, they sharply disagreed on policy, but found ways to unite the country in a bipartisan way and save Social Security along the way.
And Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful you have permitted me in the past, and I hope in the future, that singular honor, the honor of calling you my friend.
But while civility in modern politics peaked with Reagan and Tip O'Neill, that is also when both parties developed a gender gap. Reagan lost ground with women, and he gained ground with men on policy. And as that gender gap widened, moderates from both parties jumped ship. The Democrats lost conservatives like Zell Miller as their party pulled left, while Republicans lost moderates like Charlie Crist as their party pulled right.
Because there is one thing I know for certain.
I'm running as a Republican.
As an independent,
I can't tell you how comfortable I am as a Democrat.
Republicans used to have a big moderate and liberal wing in the Northeast and in California, and Democrats used to have a big moderate or conservative wing in the South. That helped balance the parties and naturally moderated our politics. But as the gender gap took hold and the country was rocked by President Clinton's sex scandal and impeachment, and then a divisive and unpopular war under President George W. Bush, both parties lost one of their wings and pulled harder to the right and harder to the left. And as that happened, each party began to dominate different regions of the country, which gave them more power to draw their state's election maps and manipulate the congressional districts to their advantage.
Now, what has changed over the years is the gerrymandering of congressional districts so that you have a predetermined outcome before the November election. You know who's going to win.
Well, that goes back more than 200 years to a man named Elbridge Gerry. To reward his party, he signed a law to redraw the districts of Massachusetts. And one of them was so rigged and squirmy, critics said it looked like a salamander, so they mockingly called it a Gerrymander, and over time, gerrymander. It came to describe the way politicians stack their districts with voters from one party or the other to keep their districts safe. And both parties have done an awful lot of stacking in the past 20 years.
It is in part because we have a closed primary system and we have gerrymandered districts to protect incumbents on Republican and Democratic sides, which for 20 years has led Republicans and Democrats to realize their path to getting reelected is to cater only to their base and to speak down to the other side, because otherwise they'll be primaried for not being a good enough Republican or Democrat.
Moderate, which by definition means keeping reasonable limits, became a dirty word in politics.
Dewhurst has served as a moderate Republican.
Meanwhile, the U.S. Supreme Court opened the floodgates to big money. Now special interests can spend unlimited cash smearing candidates they don't like.
The bulk of the vitriol that you hear in politics today is predicated by special interest groups who have stuff at stake. So, and it doesn't matter if it's left or right, all the groups are entrenched, they're fighting for their territory, and they've moved in the last 20 years to these scorched earth policies.
And then hostility and racial tensions escalated through the Trump and Obama years, even though Obama ran on the promise of bringing us together.
There is not a liberal America and a conservative America. There is the United States of America.
But his call for hope and change hit roadblocks from the start.
No, 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 not God bless America, God damn America.
The angry and inflammatory sermons from Obama's pastor turned the race to issues of race. And that took off after Obama won.
Don't you do it!
Controversies over race flared up over and over again.
Professor Gates then shows his ID to show that this is his house. And at that point, he gets arrested for disorderly conduct.
From the Henry Gates arrest and beer summit to the death of Trayvon Martin and the Zimmerman trial.
The jury fined George Zimmerman not guilty.
You're violating the state-imposed curfew.
To the shooting of Michael Brown and the conflict in Ferguson. It all stoked controversy and resentment and inflamed the nation on a fault line of race. And the since debunked birther movement that claimed Obama was a foreigner took off.
We still have not been able to wrap our hands around race relations and trying to bring people together to understand each other's culture.
Republicans took over Congress. Obama held the White House 2 years later. Gridlock set in for years, and the president broke a big campaign promise.
We're not going to use signing statements as a way of doing an end run around Congress. Whenever I can act on my own, I'm going to do that.
Then the tension and rancor escalated in 2016 with the race to succeed Obama, with the war between Clinton and Trump.
You could put half of Trump's supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables.
He made a deal with the devil.
President Trump had been a leading proponent of the birther movement, and as a candidate, he fed off of fears that had been building for years as our nation's economy and culture changed.
It's breeding resentment along lines that I'm not comfortable with, racial lines, demographic lines, ethnic lines.
We're scared. We're scared of an Obama presidency.
Here's how John McCain responded to his supporters' fears in 2008.
He is a decent person and a person that you do not have to be scared as President of the United States.
McCain tried to defuse it.
He's an Arab. He is not. No?
No, ma'am. He's a decent family man, citizen that I just happen to have disagreements with.
Now here's how Trump handled a similar situation in his race for president.
From White Plains, amen, okay? We have a problem in this country. It's called Muslims. We know our current president is one. Right. You know he's not even an American.
We need this
birth
question.
certificate, man. But anyway, we have training camps growing where they want to kill us. Mm-hmm. That's my question. When can we get rid of
We're going to be looking at a lot of different things. And, you know, a lot of people are saying that.
Trump also won by ridiculing his rivals.
As I say, crooked Hillary, crooked Hillary. So when little Marco spews his crap, be crazy Bernie. He's a crazy man.
Lion Ted.
And it worked.
I heard Lion Ted was going to be here, so we had to come represent.
You're lying.
Once again, Lion Ted!
Voters rewarded Trump.
America is a better country
without you.
And Trump's opponents responded by belittling him.
Describes his battles with venereal disease as his own personal Vietnam, of a braggadocious, arrogant buffoon.
And so the race and our national discourse degenerated into a volley of personal insults that persist to this day.
And so today, it's not enough to say the other side is wrong and here's why. It's almost an immediate step towards demonizing the other side. They're not just wrong on this issue, they're evil, they're horrible.
And that brings us to the search for solutions. We'll work through options and proposals from both parties when we come back. We're living through a spiral in which hostility and dysfunction in politics turn people off. And as they tune out, the clashes accelerate as a smaller and smaller minority splits into two tribes and takes the lead. Research from the watchdog group More in Common found 67% of Americans have disengaged. You can call them the exhausted majority, and they hold the key to restoring what most people want. Because polling also found 25% want to stand their ground and never compromise, while 75% want to work toward finding common ground. Well, as for how we fix this, activists and policymakers, of course, have different thoughts on how to do it. From adding more guardrails to social media to stop the flood of rancor and distorted information, to hoping the Facebook craze will eventually collapse as the CB radio craze did decades ago. Polling also shows 83% of Americans think we are more divided than ever before, which on one hand underscores the frustration over this deepening divide, while on the other hand makes you wonder if that 83% forgot about the Civil War and how well our schools may be teaching history and civics. Activists like former Governor and Senator Bob Graham say we have to commit more here to public education so that more citizens will become more engaged. Meanwhile, there are competing and hotly debated proposals to restore civility and compromise in Washington. Florida's Education Commissioner and former House Speaker Richard Corcoran, for example, says we need term limits.
And 8-year term limits across the board on the federal level, I promise you, you'd see a drastic decline in the rancor that you're talking about.
Another proposal, former Congressman David Jolly says we need to break the chokehold that big money has on politics. He wants tough new restrictions on political fundraising.
Simply prohibit members of Congress, your elected officials, from asking you for money. It gives them their time back to do the job they were elected to do.
So what about the politicians now who rig their districts for personal gain? Well, the U.S. Supreme Court did make it harder to stop both parties from gerrymandering. But Florida passed an amendment, and other states ask independent panels to draw the districts to make them more competitive between the parties. There are also proposals to give nonpartisan voters in Florida a say in the primaries. On that note, there are competing ideas of how to do that in our state. We'll work you through the proposals with pros and cons in the coming weeks. Meanwhile, dozens of federal lawmakers from both parties signed this civility pledge, and we'll see how well they keep that pledge in the coming years. And that brings us right back to the voters, who can reward the politicians, who can show how they can work together for common good, and show how they can disagree without being disagreeable. Closing thoughts on that when we come back. The age of social media gives isolated extremists a way to coordinate so that they're no longer isolated. And at the same time, it changed how mainstream Americans interact in ways that are far less personal and far more toxic. It feeds a cycle that stokes anger in an age in which people from different perspectives don't often mix unless they're slinging insults through a keyboard. Well, to that end, we'll continue to examine proposals to restore civility in depth. You'll find a series of long-form interviews and investigations on our YouTube channel. Search for Craig Patrick's Money, Power, and Politics and click subscribe. Meanwhile, we'll continue to map out options and potential remedies each week on Money, Power, and Politics.